Welcome to everybody who's joining us. We're excited to see the folks rolling in and very happy to welcome you to an important community conversation this evening. I'm Reverend Mary Margaret Earl, and I'm the Executive Director and Senior Minister at the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. And we're a 200-year-old organization that's deeply rooted in the past, but reaching for a better tomorrow and working for racial, social, and economic justice from our headquarters here in Roxbury. And I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Monique Marshall-Beal.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. Good evening and welcome, everyone. It's hard to believe we are truly in our fifth season of this. We started 5 years ago, and our community conversations have always highlighted the history, art, and experiences of Black and Indigenous people of color. And tonight is our third session in a series of webinars highlighting 250 years of the American Revolution. And what this series is focusing on the revolution in Roxbury, past, present, and future. And tonight, we are focusing on the importance of Black and Brown history in 2025. And we have some amazing panelists who will be joining us. I'm looking forward to this discussion. So thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening.
And thank you, Monique. And first, we're actually going to hear from a colleague of mine who worked for the urban ministry for about a decade and now is serving one of our member congregations. So I'm going to turn this over for us to hear from Reverend Susan Chorley in our Commitment Minute.
And we are so pleased. My name is Reverend Susan Chorley, and I had the privilege of serving here at First Parish of Norwell Unitarian Universalist. And we are so pleased to be sponsoring this session of community conversations, thinking about the historical implications of revolutions. What a time to be alive. What a time to be having this conversation. What a time to be supporting the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry in their mission, their witness, their outreach, and all of the ways that Reverend Mary Margaret Earl and the staff of the Urban Ministry are connecting and supporting the community in Roxbury, as well as the communities in the suburbs. Many of us in Unitarian Universalist congregations yearning and longing for a more just, equitable, and revolutionary society for all. We're so glad that you're here. We're grateful for those in our congregation who have connected around issues related to what happens at the UU Urban Ministry, as well as around racial justice. So enjoy this conversation. You too can be a part of sponsoring these conversations into the future. And we're grateful to be a part of tonight's revolutionary conversation that I'm sure will enlighten us, inspire us, and provide fuel for our journey.
And Reverend Chorley represents again First Parish Church of Norwell Unitarian Universalist, one of 46 member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. So now it's our pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. And our first panelist is Aabid Allibhai. Aabid is a PhD candidate in Harvard's Department of African and American Studies with a primary field in history. And Aabid authored the report on race and slavery at the First Church in Roxbury, which was a foundational historic interrogation that has launched a lot of important work here. And it's nice to see you, Aabid. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Aabid. I'm introducing Mary Snyder, doctoral student in American Studies at BU, who also serves as an archival intern at the Whitney Plantation and currently is a research fellow for the UUM and RHS History Committee's work on enslavement at First Church Roxbury. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us.
And now I would love to introduce Collin Knight, who's the founder and CEO of Live Like a Local Tours in Boston. He's also a member of the Urban Ministry and Roxbury Historical Society's History Committee, and he's currently also working with the young people in our after-school program to help them design their own tours of Roxbury. Welcome, Collin.
Welcome.
Thank you guys for having me.
And now I have the pleasure of introducing Reggie Walker, who is our Roxbury Youth Programs Director, and he is a graduate of UMass with a master's in history, and he oversees the work to engage our young people in the Roxbury community's history and works very closely with Collin Knight. Welcome, Reggie.
Thank you all for having me.
Right. So what is really, I was reflecting on this group of panelists, thinking that, in some ways you form this continuum. So Aabid was, did this historic research that really launched this interrogation into the history of First Church Roxbury. So important to lay that groundwork. Mary, as a graduate student at BU, we were able to engage her and her colleague Micah Kane to advance that historic interrogation through a Harvard Reparative Partnership grant. And then Reggie is working with that, especially Micah, on bringing that information, that knowledge to young people in our after-school program. And then Collin is working with the young people to sort of take that historic understanding out into the community to share the history of Roxbury with the community. So there's really an interesting way that your work all connected in some ways. So we're really excited for you to share the work and also to talk about why you are so committed to it. So each of you is, again, working with us to tell this history of enslavement. And I wondered if you could talk about what drew you to this history and this work. What is it that inspires you? And maybe I'm going to start with Aabid.
Sure. So thank you, Mary Margaret. Thank you, Monique, Veal, and to the UUM for having this great conversation. I'm delighted to be here. And so to answer your question, Mary Margaret, really this work was when I moved here in 2015, I became fascinated by the huge gap in the rhetoric around Boston, the so-called Cradle of Liberty, and what I was learning primarily in at that time, before I was in my PhD program, from different activists who taught me about the history of slavery in New England, and particularly how institutions like the one I'm at now, Harvard, a lot of prominent people in the colonial period in Massachusetts, particularly in the Boston area, how they all benefited from slavery. So that's what got me, started doing this research in Boston in particular. And then when I began doing some research at the Shirley Eustis House Museum several years ago, that's also in Roxbury, I learned how prevalent slavery and enslavement was, not only in along the Freedom Trail, but also in places like Roxbury, where very little research on the history of enslavement had been done. So that's what drew me in particular to the work in Roxbury.
Thank you. Mary, I wonder if you want to answer that same question.
Yeah, I was actually just getting ready to jump in and say I had a very similar experience as Aabid in terms of moving here. For me, it was much more recently. It was in 2022, moving here and having a mixed understanding of what Boston was supposed to be. You know, some friends were telling me, and I was moving from the South at this point in time. I was moving from Virginia, DC area. And so I had some friends that were telling me, you know, I don't know if I'm going to visit you. Boston is a racist city. I had other friends that were like, oh, Boston, what a great feel, or what a great area for you to be in terms of studying the history of enslavement in the US. Because of its abolition movement. So I had like this dichotomy already. And I wanted to bridge the gap, understand what the realities were, because it's always somewhere in the middle. And what I especially appreciated about what you all are doing at First Church Roxbury is you're not just seeking to find the answers, which is huge and a critical part of restoration, but it's also you are doing that with a lens towards social justice and education. So I feel so grateful to be here tonight to just kind of be a part of this conversation, but I also feel grateful to contribute in whatever way I can to helping you all continue to build the narrative around Roxbury, around Boston, around Black history, Black mobilization, resistance, community, all of that. It's been a very enlightening journey, building on what Aabid has already produced, which is very foundational to filling this vital gap in our historic record. As someone who has been in the museum field in the South, working to interpret and do storytelling around those who were enslaved on the plantation in the cities, it's been interesting to see the difference, but to understand that both systems were working in a very similar way for a very similar purpose. And I think being able to expand those historic narratives on a local level up to the very top is going to be critical for dismantling a lot of those superficial, harmful narratives that we put out that have shaped our public memory. And so I'm happy to be a part of it. And the other component, like I said, was education. So in addition to doing the research, it's really building a database so that the community, students, and Reggie, I know you and Micah can speak to this more, but students can engage in historical examination, which I think is such a critical exercise in building social awareness, understanding there's multiple perspectives, and as a result, gaining empathy. So very happy to be a part. I hope that explains everything.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mary.
It does. Thank you. Collin, I'd love to give you a chance to respond too.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me tonight. I'm really grateful to be on such a distinguished panel with all these great people. I want to apologize for the motion sensors here at the UUM, so it may go out. You might see me waving to to get some motion again. Yeah, I think for me, growing up, you know, in the Boston public school system, you know, local history was not really a part of the curriculum. We learned more about the Revolutionary War and more of the European history. And so I didn't become interested in the history of Boston and the history of Roxbury from the Black and Brown or Indigenous perspective until well into my adult life. And, you know, I would say it's definitely pretty unfortunate. But I, you know, spent some time away from Boston to pursue a career in acting. And one of my odd jobs was working for a tour company. And when I got back to Boston in 2014, I wanted to pursue my own tour company. And that's how I got into history. And so once I realized that I wanted to do a tour that was different than the Freedom Trail and the European historical tours downtown, I started thinking about food and culture and art. And then I started thinking about, well, I should know some of the history of these areas as well. And then I started teaching myself and researching about the history of Jamaica Plain and Dorchester, and specifically Roxbury. I grew up in John Eliot Square, which is where the First Church in Roxbury is. And, you know, growing up, I didn't know anything about the history of this community, not the Native American history or the European history, nor did I know much about the Black history. And so it's come really full circle for me, coming from this community and now really dedicating to my life to preserving the history, you know, particularly the Black history of this community, and pushing to make sure that young people understand the importance of preserving the history of this community. Is we have to pass it on. And so you know, standing, you know, on the shoulders of, you know, Dr. Carolyn Crockett and Byron Rushing, you know, who have done it way before me. And I'm really proud to say that, you know, I'm doing my best to make sure that young people understand what it looks like to know about the historical figures. You know, they're walking down Melnia Cass Boulevard, but they have no idea who she is. Some of these young people are going to the O'Brien, but don't know who John D. O'Brien is. There's a big mural of Mel King, who actually went to Boston Tech, but they don't know who he is and the importance of what he was able to do in this community. And so I'm dedicating my life to making sure that young people and people from all walks of life and all communities understand what this neighborhood is, you know, what it will be, from my perspective. And I think that's important.
Great. Thank you, Collin. Reggie, anything to add? For your love of history?
Of course. Similar to Aabid and Mary, I'm not from Boston. I'm originally from California. And as many folks know, when you're learning about history, Boston's kind of almost like the Mecca, and you always hear of growing up, you always hear about all these amazing things that happen in Boston, all this amazing history. And I always wondered why there wasn't a whole lot of Black history. So as someone that's always been obsessed with history, I went to undergrad in California, got my history degree, and was still obsessed with this idea of Boston and wanting to just move there and kind of figure it out. And I ended up moving here for grad school, where I was working with college students, and really working in student affairs. And while that was amazing, I knew that I wanted to do more on the ground work, because in another part of my life, I work with students for several weeks at a time, where I really kind of work with them and help them kind of figure out who they are and figure out who they want to be. And I knew growing up I could have used somebody like that. So I really wanted to find a way to give back to my community and continue to teach all the amazing historical things that are going on in Boston, not only from the history that's typically told, but also from a Black perspective, and also help students understand their own personal history, understand what's happening in the world now, and how we can create change moving forward if we learn from the things that have happened and are continuing to happen. So thank you all for again having me today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
I was just reflecting on Collin, your work and what you had to say about being able to walk around the city and see buildings and places that resonate or that memorialize Black history. And I think, you know, I was like, that's another thing that I think is so critical about the work here, is that it is site-based, it is community-based, because I do think, I appreciate that you're creating visibility within the built environment too, because it is something that we interact with day to day. And I mean, I don't know where I'm going with this, except for to say that I appreciate your work. And I think especially as things become more difficult within your traditional educational spheres, the work that Collin, Reggie, you all are doing is becoming even more critical, and being able to attach those histories, those stories to a landscape is something that can't necessarily be erased, something that becomes greatly accessible if we do it right. So anyways, kudos to you too. Also, I apparently need to take a tour.
Yeah,
So if
Mary,
you haven't
thank
been on
you.
Collin's tour, it's awesome. It's awesome.
Thank you. Mary, thank you for saying that, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing to uncover the history of enslaved people within our community as well. And I think for me, it's really important that it is site-based. I think, it's particularly for young people, it doesn't matter to them unless they can see it. And so if they can see a mural of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, if they can see a mural of Mel King, it's really, you know, great to be able to talk about it as well as being able to look at the mural and be able to add that to the actual history and tidbits that I may talk about. And so I'm constantly thinking about ways to engage young people when we're talking about taking a historical tour. What does that look like for them, and how am I going to engage them in figuring out, for themselves, what does this history mean to them? And how will they be able to carry it on and tell their kids about it, regardless of whether the landscape changes? I'm, gonna, connect to gentrification that's happening within our community, which is something that I also talk about on the tours as well. Is if there are a bunch of new buildings within Nubian Square, who's going to be able to talk about what used to be there, right? And so making sure that they understand what the history is and so that they can carry it on is really, really important to me. So
That's awesome. That speaks to my preservation heart, and that's I think something that really needs to be pushed forward more is having a more inclusive mindset when it comes to preservation. It's not just the aesthetically pleasing, but it is these places that hold true stories that have impacted real lives. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mary. I'm listening to you all talk about the young people and carrying the story forward and expanding their knowledge about history. And we all know that at this moment in time, there are lots of changes happening that are impacting the climate that we're in right now at the federal level and even local level. And there's a real push to erase this history and to quiet it down. And I'm just wondering if, what you all's thoughts are about why these changes are wrong and why we have to fight really hard to make sure that this information is not pushed away and put under the carpet and hidden from our next generations.
And maybe we can actually maybe ask Aabid to jump in on that question.
Yeah.
Aabid?
Yeah.
Sure. So I think, one of the main things is what we've learned from this push, Monique, that you just talked about, is that history matters. And sometimes it's hard to for us to put in words why that is the case. But it's been used as because for us, a lot of us, it's just so visceral and so psychologically tied into our identity and how we view ourselves and how we view this nation. But I think one major thing is that how we view the past and the stories we tell about our past have very concrete present day implications. The stories that we tell can either justify, the rampant social, racial, and economic inequality that we have right now, or it can delegitimize it and push us to enact policies to reverse, for instance, racial wealth inequality. But if we erase, as you alluded to, if we erase that history, if we erase the history of highways going through Black neighborhoods, of just racial terrorism in the South, if we erase the history of redlining, and all those other histories that together congeal to produce an environment that we have today where the Black family on average owns 15 cents on every to every dollar the average white family owns. Then if we don't understand why that's the case, then the myths that a lot of people have put out in the past, the racist myths about that have to do with irresponsibility or two-parent households, or some more generally racist and or individualist kind of reasoning for injustice in society rather than something structural. And if we allow that to happen, then we can justify, normalize racial inequality. And also at the policy level, we can, it allows folks to cut back on certain policies that are enacted to remedy such inequalities. To say they're wasteful, or it's an example of reverse what racism, or it's not going to work because certain racist accusations of certain people not having the program's not going to be able to help people who can't help themselves, or whatever we've been hearing and are currently hearing from Republicans right now.
Thank you.
Before I just do want to let our audience know that we want others to jump in here, but in terms of the audience, if you want to put your questions, if you start to have questions, you can put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We're going to save a little time at the end, so if questions start popping into your mind, you can put your question in any time, and we'll save a few minutes at the end to ask. So sorry about interrupting that flow. Monique, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I wanted to make sure that someone else, if they wanted to respond to the question, feel free, jump right in. Thank you, Collin.
Yeah, no, I think everything that Aabid was saying is so right. When we talk about the erasure of history and what it can do, particularly to communities of color, is is a really saddening thing for me. When I think about first, I would argue that even if they're going to try to erase the history, it's up to us as communities of color across the country to teach our people about this history, which is what I'm doing on these tours each and every day. And why I'm trying to get Boston Public Schools and suburban schools to come to the community and learn about the history from my perspective. And if it's one of those things, excuse me, I'm gonna wave again. It's one of those things where if you can erase the history, then it really didn't exist in the first place. And that's, I think the troubling part. And again, even growing up, I talked about not learning about any of the local history. So it can be that you can erase it or you just don't teach it at all. It's just not a part of any of the curriculums. And so while it's an issue that there's the erasure and the critical race theory thing that is coming up and how it's being weaponized, it's also the fact that it's not really a part of any of the curriculums in the first place. And when a kid can't tell you about their local, figures and activists who made change within their own communities, how are we expecting them to be able to teach other people and tell other people about the community and be proud about the history of their community? I was having a conversation with Reggie earlier about the Black Panther movement and the free breakfast program, and the fact that the free breakfast program really proved that communities of color could do it on their own. They didn't need anybody to feed them. And the fact that the president at the time felt like that this was a dangerous thing for African Americans to have this free breakfast program, so that we didn't have to feel ashamed that we could do this on our own. And so what did they do? They couldn't stop us. And then they ended up creating their own free breakfast program that still exists today. And it's not to empower us, but then for us to be charity cases rather. And those are the things that I think that young people should know about, that, we have fought and we have done things that are great. And we have figured out things, when it comes to our communities, to make them better without the help of the government. Right. And so these are very important stories that need to be told. So it's not just about the erasure of, the history books. It's about us and the people who hold that history, the elders, the people that are older than these young people, to be able to figure out creative ways to be able to tell those stories so that they live on.
Mhm. Thank you, Colin.
Yeah,
you.
I completely agree with. Oh, sorry. Were you saying something, Mary Margaret?
No, jump right in, Reggie,
Okay.
please.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Colin. And the things that we're losing, it's not just Black history, but the Black stories, it's Black labor, it's Black body, all these things that come with along with Black history. Like I was telling the students before, my grandma she was a sharecropper. And that's when you put it in the context of history and how long ago slavery was. My grandma was born early 1900s. And so that means she was a slave cropper, sorry, a sharecropper at the top of the century. And it's like the important thing for folks, not only in politics, specifically on the right, but just in general, is that Black history isn't just history. It's alive, it's changing. And by them trying to take away Black history, you're not helping any of not only the Black kids, but like the white kids too. And we've been having this conversation about like the dismantling of critical race theory and the argument from the right that it is taught to have white kids feel bad about themselves, but it's not taught to have white kids feel bad about themselves. It's to have Black kids know their history so they can feel good about who they are. And I think that's a really hard thing to teach. And folks aren't always going to understand, but it's not necessarily our job to teach white folks our history, but it's our job to have ownership and the want to move it forward, because if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I would just
Yeah.
add quickly too, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but I think it's okay for white people to feel uncomfortable too, right? These are conversations that are uncomfortable about the history of Europeans in this country. And I think it's okay for white people to feel uncomfortable. And because white people are going to feel uncomfortable during these conversations, if we were to allow the full truth and the full history to be told, I think that's a lot of the reason why, because people, white people around the dinner table, don't want to have these conversations with their kids about the true history of the country. And so therein lies the issue. It's like, it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to have uncomfortable conversations within the classroom and around the dinner table about what America actually is as a society, as a country. So
I think it's important to be uncomfortable when it comes to grappling with history. I mean, regardless of where your perspective is, you're probably going to be uncomfortable with US history if you actually face it forthrightly. I feel like working in these public history spaces have an opportunity to have those uncomfortable conversations a lot with white people, because they think that they can ask me those questions, like being in an enslaved quarter and saying, well, this isn't so bad, right? And they'll push and they'll push and they'll push. And I welcome that conversation because we need to have it. The sad thing is that it's not until adulthood that they're finally having these conversations. And so to backtrack on history, on Black history, that means we're removing it from a very, very ripe, formidable age when these students have the ability to grasp the fact that that this is an opportunity for us to learn from the past, to empathize with each other, and to build a more equitable future, rather than a lot of the conversations I feel like I have with white adults is that, well, if we do this program for DEI, or which is a bad term now, I guess, but if we do these, offer these services, if we support this group, then I lose. But it's not a win-lose situation. If we understand history fully, we understand the systems that are in place that aren't working. They especially don't work for certain groups in our population, but they aren't working. They don't value humanity. And when we can see that this is that history provides the roadmap, it provides the evidence It's like trying to do science without any evidence, without doing the testing. If we try to reform politics, community, culture without history, we don't know what we're doing. We don't have the roadmap to fix things. And I think, the fight for having an inclusive history has been ongoing since the start of this country, since the start of this nation, and even before, honestly, because history is powerful. It shapes the way that we view power, who deserves power, who deserves representation and voice. And so not only has that erasure been a constant fight, but now we're in a space where we have felt like we were getting progress. We were being more vocal about Black history, Brown history, Latinx history. And so now to make the move and actually backtrack, we're saying to individuals, we're saying to communities, we're saying to corporations that these voices don't very loudly, louder than ever before. And that's scary. And that's why it's wrong. But that's why it's so important that you all are doing the work that you do in informal ways, that we are building community so that when those formal systems of education, of diversity, systems that are supposed to be providing medical service, housing, support in all of these different ways, when those aren't working, we know from the history books, the Black community has always been there. The local communities have always been there to rise up. It shouldn't be that way, but here we are.
Thank you.
Thank
Mary.
you. So one of the questions that comes up for me, as you all think about this history, and why, and how since the beginning of the United States, that this was, this history has been pushed aside and quieted. And we've told this narrative about like the creation of our country and the founding fathers, and we've told this narrative. And one of the questions that I have is, in this moment that we are in nationally, many people are troubled about where we are as a country and how uncertain things are and how difficult things feel. And I wonder how this might look different to when we look at where we are as a country from an African-American perspective, or from the perspective of a person of color, versus where we're seeing it as even a white person who may be on the same political page, but seeing what this history, what is this moment, how do we understand this moment in a historical context, and how that might be different depending on what perspective you're looking at it from.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Sure. Now you go ahead, Reggie, and I'll.
All right. So for me, it really, and it's concerning because, I'm only 27 and I'm frankly tired of living through historical moments, but it feels like we really are in such a large turning point in our history where, there's a certain group of people in power that are making it okay to hate again. And that's very bizarre especially what Mary was just saying, where we put all this work into the last few years of trying to amplify Black voices and change the narrative and really make it so that we're moving America towards whatever this grand vision of the American dream is. But we're not doing that. And I feel like as a Black person, and I'm not very old, I'm still pretty young, but it feels like it's back to how everything was before it was okay to have these hard conversations. It feels like before it was okay to say, like, listen, I'm having a hard time dealing with this because I feel this way or because of my lived experiences, or just being honest and open about who you can be and who you are. It feels like we're taking an active step back, and that could be very concerning. And from my friends that are left leaning and have similar political viewpoints as me, for them it's like they have never seen it before, or like they're extremely surprised, or it's the most shocking thing in the world. And it's like they've been telling us and giving us the playbook for a while, and you just had to pay attention. So for me, it's extremely saddening, but it's not surprising. And to my colleagues, it seems like even though the writing's been on the wall, It's like it just came out of nowhere, which is shocking to me.
Aabid
Yeah.
was gonna go. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything Reggie just said, and really resonate, especially with what he said at the end. I think when you look at it seems to me at least that a lot of white Americans are unwilling to accept that what is going on right now is a lot um, more normal than in the long course of American history than they think. And for a lot of non-white Americans, particularly Black and Indigenous Americans, it's a lot, as Reggie mentioned, a lot less surprising. And I do think, you know, you will find a lot of people of color that are in mainstream institutions that are very, liberal, sometimes even conservative in their politics, in part of the military, part of the, federal government, part of, one of the two major political parties. Um, and um, it will they will be very patriotic, but at the same time very critical of the history of the country, or it's just, a normal thing to say, yeah, America's always been racist or always been this way, or just a comment like, and there's a certain form of patriotism, particularly among white people, that those two things can't be true at the same time. And so that's one thing, and I think, again, to piggyback off what Reggie was saying, I think, one of the reasons for all this is especially for white Americans, but not only for white Americans, and certainly not even all white Americans, but a good group of white Americans, even liberal ones, say that, their identities are tied up with the history of the country. So, you could there's this tendency for a lot of liberal Americans to say, to accept that there has been bad things throughout American history, but that the overall course of American history, the course of events, the is one of the narrative arc is one of progress, and that is something that doesn't it's just hard to look at American history for a lot of people and see that that's the case. And I think because their identity is so tied up in the character of America, it's much easier to ignore that fact and have that reckoning, and easier to point to other things that are very important but don't necessarily get to the core issue, such as um, you know economics or something else, which again are very important.
Thank you. Collin, you want to respond? Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, and I'm not very old, I just feel like historically in America, for African Americans, it's kind of like deja vu, I mean, we get excited about the Emancipation Proclamation, and then Reconstruction hits, and we get excited about the Civil Rights Movement, and then, we're set back again, and then you have the Black Lives Matter movement, and now here we are. And so, for me, it's hard to be optimistic, because at any point, as a Black person in America, you always feel like you're not in control of, you're not in control of what happens, and that systemic oppression will always reign supreme, for lack of a better term. And so that's disappointing, and I'm not really sure like what we do about that. And I, we talked a little bit about DE&I, and to be honest, it's not really about the terms, because you make a new term and they weaponize that term. It's really about the work that we're all trying to do. And even if we're being honest, when I think about DE&I, it's not really about African Americans. I think a lot of people come before African Americans. We're talking about DE&I, and particularly white women at the top. And we think about DE&I positions, white women are at the top and have a higher percentage of those jobs, right? And so while we're fighting for DE&I as Black people, when I think about the caste system, if you will, we're still at the bottom of that, like we're at the bottom of the caste system for everything else. And so I want to be hopeful that things will change, but I don't think it'll change without us, as a community trying to do it together, and we're going to need white allies to support that, right? Or, liberals, if you will, to really understand what's happening, and to get out of their own way. Aabid spoke to it, where it's a situation where it's like, hey, like all of these things happen, but, we're moving forward. There is progress being made. And I think the problem is like, the things that are happening aren't really happening to white people, right? They're not dealing with these things in the way that people of color, particularly Black people, are dealing with it. So yeah, it's not that bad for them, right? But it's really terrible for us. And we're in this cycle consistently over decades, at a time where things are okay and then there's a setback. And so there are a lot of things that I think we need to do as a country to really fess up and face what's really going on, and really try to come together as a country, regardless of who's in office, regardless of what political party you're in. We have to do the work together, rainbow coalition style, right? If you will. And until that happens, this is going to continue to be a cycle, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you. I will say this again, but I'm always feel really honored that the urban ministry can be a place where like the truth can be spoken. So thank you. Thank you. So I think we're going to move into some questions because there's lots of questions coming in. So we don't have a lot of time. Monique, you want to take the first one?
Sure will. And I will say thank you. Just hearing you all talk about how much we can control, the things that we have to do and how we have to do that as a community is so important. And it doesn't mean that any one group has an answer to every situation, but if we work together, we can find some. I'm hopeful that we can find some solution, but that doesn't come without some hard conversations and some levels of accountability. So thank you all. This is from Karen. Your work is so inspiring and so vital. Thanks for sharing this work with us. The Black Lives Matter mural in DC, and in DC's Black Lives Matter Square is being taken down. And the administration's threat that it's useless is the administration's threat that unless it is taken down, DC won't receive federal transportation funds. What ways can we support your efforts to push back on this erasure trend? Who wants to jump in? How can people in our audience fight with you and support the work that you're doing?
One very specific thing that came to mind. Thank you, by the way, for this question. This is great. I appreciate that you're solution oriented. It's like, okay, we're in this. What do I do? I will just say the International African American Museum is running a program right now. Everyone is welcome to participate. And it's basically to capture and preserve Black history. So in any medium possible. So if you want direction on how you can capture what's happening and know that it's going to be preserved in a repository and steward, that's one resource. I know there's plenty of others, but just a quick, they've got great resources too.
I would even add like 4 easy things you could do are don't tune it out, understand what's happening, and as easy as it can be to turn off the TV or turn off the news and not pay attention to it. The more attention we draw to it, the better chance we have of stopping. Hold your officials accountable. I know that's not the easiest thing, but call them, write them. They may be annoyed. I don't care. Call them 4 times, call them 5 times. That's their job. And lastly, similar to what Mary just said, organize, join a group. If there's not a group, make one, you know? And my last thing is continue to be an ally. Like we Black folks are trying, and people of color in general are trying to fight this fight. And while we can do it, it'd be nice to have other groups join us in the fight so that we can show us united front and try to get some change done. But if we continue to remain fractioned and easily break apart, which is what they want us to do, nothing's going to get done because we've seen it happen time and time again where we organize, it gets broken apart, the thing fails. For a perfect example, what Collin said about free school lunch. Boom. Like it's a perfect example. So stay tuned in, hold your officials accountable, organize, be an ally.
Gee.
Hmm.
Dave Harrington from Theodore Parker said, thanks for a wonderful discussion. How should this account of Black history take into account aspects of oppression, sometimes violent, like lynchings in the South, but sometimes closer to home, like redlining tours and like redlining in Boston? Collin, do you discuss redlining in your tours?
Yeah, there are definitely some aspects of talking about that as it intersects with gentrification as well. So recently, and for 2 years, I've done a separate tour called Once Upon a Time in Nubian Square, and I work with a really great gentleman, Marlon Solomon, from Afro American Academy, and he really focuses on cultural hubs and focuses on the past, present, and future effects of redlining and gentrification. Excuse me. Sorry. And so I would really hope to get some, members on the tour next year when we do it during Black History Month, because Marlon does a great job in like covering the Roxbury area in the South End as well, and he does a whole workshop at the Roxbury Public Library on redlining and how not just Roxbury but the West End and Dorchester and Chinatown and all of these areas were redlined, and how this is not just about African American people when we're talking about redlined. A lot of communities of color were ripped apart due to redlining. And so while I don't talk about it as much on my tour, we do have a specific tour that we've been doing for the last 2 years that really talks about that and covers that through Marlon's workshop and through us kind of just talking about the history of the Roxbury community. So I would encourage members to join that, and we'll put together some materials for the UUM so that we can put that out there so we can get more people on that tour. And thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Aabid, were you going to say something? Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just gonna say everything that Collin said, and please, make sure you go on his tours. I was also gonna add that, well, first, the most obvious thing, take it into account. In some states, like my home state of Florida, it's that that's becoming harder to do without getting fired as a teacher. Or you can say these kinds of things, but you can't specify who is being redlined and who is being lynched. The second thing is, I think that these are not these are not a lot of times historians might write or think about this as one-time events. So these things happened in the past, these horrible lynchings happened in the past, redlining happened in the past, but they are events, have afterlives. And so when we talk about these things, we need to ensure, in my opinion, that we make clear and investigate the ongoing effects of these things. Lynchings haunt people, destroy families, and haunt people for generations on generations in many ways: emotional, psychological, financial. And the same with something like redlining. And in a lot of ways, one is a lot more violent than the other, but both are violent in their own way, and we should emphasize that. And also, the importance in the present of these kinds of events.
Yeah, I would
Thank
just
you.
add really quickly too, when we think about, and I agree with everything that Aabid's saying. It's for me, there's a lot of violent aspects of redlining that happen in our history. You look at Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Black Wall Street. I would look at that as redlining too, but it was just very, very violent. Rosewood and places like that. And there were many places where African Americans, built their own communities, and were ripped apart from them, and terrible things happen. We think about Native Americans when their places, their territories were just taken away from them. That's also redlining too, right? And so I agree with everything that Aabid's saying, is that redlining looks a lot of different ways historically. And so we need to definitely pay attention to that too. That it's not just you taking in, communities by eminent domain, but, they were also being taken away, and lives were being taken as well as the land too. So.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And I apologize in advance. We're not going to be able to get through all the questions, Mary Margaret, but I think we have one question that we kind of can close with, because it's really a call to action for some of our congregations. So this question is from Cushing. Thank you for all the wonderful work you are doing to widen the window of honest, accurate history, a window that only recently opened. Intense pressures are being brought to bear in efforts to close that window and return the taught history of this country to a whites-only storyline. In addition to the profound thoughts you have shared already this evening, are there additional strategies for all of us, including member congregations supporting the urban ministry, to contribute to the challenge of keeping this window open and continue to open it wider? And also, I hope our Christian brothers and sisters can be brought to awareness that DEI is the Latin word for of God. So what can our audience members and member congregations do to help
We have 1
this
minute.
effort? Yes.
So it's a really
So
quick, it's a really like
10 seconds
2
for
or
everybody,
5
maybe.
word answer. Yeah.
So what can they do to help and support this work?
I would say go on Collins Live Like a Local tours is one thing. And so that's we post Live Like a Local on our website. So you can go to Live Like a Local tours, his website. That's one thing.
And
2
thank you for
words.
that too. That
Yep.
2 words, I think that we should just continue to work together. I think we need to support the work of Mary and Aabid too. They're doing great work. So how can we
Yes.
continue to support them? They need to to be able to live and do that work, to bring out the true stories of like what's happening in our country. And so we need to figure out how we can support them. So yeah, I would say that.
Two
Thank you,
final
Collins.
words.
And the youth program that Reggie runs.
Yay.
That too.
Support the
Thank
youth
you.
program.
Excellent. Yes.
Yay.
Yes,
Great.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And keep tuning in. The next community conversation will be the RYP youth talking about revolution tomorrow. So I want to thank this panel of people for sharing your brilliance and your truth at a time when we need it more than ever, and to lean into it and to lean into this history and telling it. So thank you. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. Please come to our next community conversations, and onward, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.